Thank you. We will now restart proceedings, and we will now proceed with a division on amendment number 14. And members should cast their vote now. The vote is now closed. Yeah, if you I'll start group 3 and I'll call whoever it is. Thank you. The result of the vote on amendment number 14 in the name of Pauline McNeill is yes 46, no 70. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 15 in the name of Pauline McNeill, already debated with amendment 12. Pauline McNeill to move or not move? Not moved. I call amendment 16 in the name of Pauline McNeill, already debated with amendment 12. Pauline McNeill to move or not move?
Moved.
Moved. The question is that amendment 16 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
The Parliament is agreed. I call amendment 17 in the name of Pauline McNeill, already debated with amendment 12. Pauline McNeill to move or not move?
Moved.
Moved. The question is that amendment 17 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is agreed. I call amendment 18 in the name of Pauline McNeill, already debated with amendment 12. Pauline McNeill to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. I call amendment 24 in the name of Pauline McNeill, already debated with amendment 12. Pauline McNeill to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. I call amendment 19 in the name of Pauline McNeill, already debated with amendment 12. Pauline McNeill to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. I call amendment 20 in the name of Pauline McNeill, already debated with amendment 12. Pauline McNeill to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. I call amendment 21 in the name of Pauline McNeill, already debated with amendment 12. Pauline McNeill to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. I call amendment 22 in the name of Pauline McNeill, already debated with amendment 12. Pauline McNeill to move or not move?
Moved.
Not moved. I call amendment 23 in the name of Pauline McNeill, already debated with amendment 12. Pauline McNeill to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. I call amendment 25 in the name of Pauline McNeill, already debated with amendment 12. Pauline McNeill to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. And that concludes discussion on Group 2. And we now turn to Group 3, Procedures for Misconduct. I call amendment 5 in the name of Sharon Dowie, grouped with Amendment 6, and I call on Sharon Dowie to move Amendment 5 and to speak to both amendments in the group. Ms Dowie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Prior to this bill, a police officer whose behaviour was found to amount to gross misconduct would be able to avoid disciplinary proceedings by simply resigning or retiring. Fortunately, this bill seeks to close that loophole. However, when taking evidence in this bill, the Criminal Justice Committee heard concerns that officers may not be aware of this change. As such, a constable may resign, thinking it will get them off the hook, only to realise when it's too late to rescind their resignation that proceedings will continue in their absence. My Amendment 5 therefore seeks to ensure a constable is informed at the earliest possible opportunity that resigning or retirement is not a route of avoiding disciplinary proceedings. It does this by requiring notice to be given to a constable following a determination that the allegation against the person amounts to gross misconduct. That disciplinary procedures may be applied in relation to a person who resigns or retired. This means that at the point at which the constable is informed there are proceedings against them, they are also informed that they will continue whether or not they resign. This drafting ensures that notice is given at the most useful time, making sure the constable has all the information available before making the decision to resign. This amendment is very similar to the amendment I brought forward at stage 2, and I thank the Scottish Government for working with me to bring this back at stage 3, ensuring that constables are kept fully informed of the new rules at the earliest possible opportunity. On Amendment 6, this bill, as originally drafted, allows for disciplinary proceedings to be conducted against police officers after they have left the force, so long as they were being disciplined for gross misconduct. A caveat to this was that the bill also included a requirement that regulations must set out a time limit for disciplinary proceedings to be brought forward after a constable has resigned. This is sensible in my view, as it is important to prevent stale allegations from being pursued against former constables for an indefinite or lengthy period after they ceased to be a constable. As such, the effect of my Amendment 6 would require that these regulations set out that disciplinary proceedings cannot be brought against an officer more than a year after they resigned or retired. This ensures that investigations into an officer's misconduct are current and timely, and prevents regulations from allowing for a time limit which is of an undue length. This also ensures stale allegations are not routinely pursued to the extent which the investigatory body is overwhelmed with historic allegations, limiting their ability to investigate current and live officers' misconduct. This comes with two caveats. Firstly, this is a presumption only, and the Scottish Government assures me that the regulations will set out tests or special criteria which can determine whether it is reasonable and proportionate to apply the disciplinary procedures to the former constable after more than 1 year. I would appreciate if the Cabinet Secretary would reaffirm that to the Chamber when she's summing up. And secondly, whilst this amendment does mean disciplinary proceedings cannot be brought against an officer for an indefinite period of time, this does not prevent criminal proceedings being brought against an ex-officer for historic allegations. This is a sensible measure to add to the bill, and I am happy to press the amendments in my name.
Thank you. I now call the Cabinet Secretary.
Signing Officer, again, I'm happy to have engaged with Ms Dowie after stage 2 on these amendments, which I support. Provision requiring a notice to a constable that proceedings will continue in absentia was intended to be provided for in regulations, so I support the principle of this amendment. Again, a requirement that conduct regulations state a time limit of no more than 1 year from the date of resignation, after which misconduct procedures cannot be applied, is another provision that was intended for inclusion in regulations. I agree it is important to prevent stale allegations from being pursued against former constables, but of course the time limit must be capable of being disapplied when justice requires it. The regulations will set out tests or special criteria which will determine whether it is reasonable and proportionate to apply the disciplinary procedures to former constables after more than 1 year to provide for the exceptional cases, and I hope Parliament will also support these amendments.
Thank you, Colin. Sharon Dowie. To wind up, press to withdraw Amendment 5. Ms Dowie.
I've wound up, so I'll move that. Thank you.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 5 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is agreed. I call Amendment 6 in the name of Sharon Dowie. Already debated with Amendment 5. Sharon Dowie, to move or not move?
Move.
The question is Amendment 6 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament is agreed. I call Amendment 26 in the name of Polly McNeill. Already debated with Amendment 12. Polly McNeill, to move or not move?
Not moved.
That is not moved. We move to Group 4, Minor and Technical. I call Amendment 1 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, grouped with Amendments 2 and 3. Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 1 and speak to the other amendments in the group.
Presiding Officer, the three amendments in this group are minor tidying up amendments. The first relates to the advisory and barred list provisions in section 7 of the bill. It simply removes unnecessary repetition of a number, namely 59A, for compliance with standard drafting practice and does not have any practical effect. Amendments 2 and 3 relate to the provisions within the bill that give the PERC a new power to review a policy or practice of the police, where the PERC considers it is in the public interest to do so. At stage 2, the Criminal Justice Committee supported an amendment brought forward by Sharon Dowie to require that the PERC must consult HMICS before undertaking such a review, which I supported. This insertion would better meet the intention of the amendment if it appears on its own and earlier in the process, so that these amendments remove the provision from its current location and insert a new subsection requiring the PERC to consult HMICS before deciding whether to carry out the review. And I would ask all members to support technical amendments 1, 2 and 3 today.
Thank you. No other members have asked to speak. Cabinet Secretary, anything to add by way of wind-up?
No, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament's agreed. We move to Group 5, Review of Misconduct Policies, Practices and Guidance. Call Amendment 7 in the name of Sharon Dowie in a group on its own. Sharon Dowie to move and speak to Amendment 7.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. What good is a new code of ethics if it is not reflected in practice by Police Scotland? One of my biggest concerns about the new code of ethics would be that it just becomes another piece of work that sits on a shelf and gathers dust for years, not making the change that was promised. My Amendment 7 creates a new freestanding section in the bill, placing a one-off duty on the Chief Constable to review misconduct policies, practices and guidance. The Chief Constable is required to make changes that are appropriate in light of the Code of Ethics as soon as practicable. The amendment requires the review to take place within a year from the commencement of this section of the bill, allowing time for the Code of Ethics to be published and the new set of conduct rules to be put in place before the review begins. This means that the review will be of the new policies, practices and procedures to ensure they are fit for purpose. It's our responsibility as a Parliament to ensure that the legislation we pass is meaningful and effective. This amendment goes some way to ensuring this, and I am happy to place it in my name. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call the Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I support this amendment, which places a one-off duty on the Chief Constable to review misconduct policies, practices and guidance. I have worked constructively with Ms Dowie on this following her Stage 2 amendments in this area. I agree very much with the member's intention to ensure that practices, policies and guidance related to misconduct are aligned with the Code of Ethics insofar as appropriate. The amendment will mean that the Chief Constable will have 1 year from the commencement of the section to carry out the review. This is important because it will allow the Code of Ethics to be published and the new set of conduct regulations to be made, ensuring the review will be of the up-to-date policies, practices and guidance. And I ask Parliament to support the amendment.
Thank you. It calls Sharon Dowie to wind up press to withdraw Amendment 7.
Nothing to add. Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 7 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament has agreed. We move to Group 6, and that on complaints handling, information provided to complainer. I call Amendment 28 in the name of Douglas Ross in a group on its own, and I call on Douglas Ross to move and speak to Amendment 28. Mr Ross.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And can I begin by thanking the Presiding Officer for accepting this manuscript amendment. I know it's unusual, particularly at Stage 3, to bring back or bring into the debate a topic that hadn't been discussed by the committee and didn't have the scrutiny of the committee. But I hope I can explain in my opening remarks the lateness of the amendment coming in and my reasoning behind that amendment. Just 1 week ago, myself and the First Minister met with the family of murdered Nairn banker Alistair Wilson. Veronica and Andrew came down to Parliament to meet with the First Minister, a commitment John Swinney gave in this chamber and delivered on. And during our discussions with the First Minister, the family raised their issues around the complaint system against Police Scotland. The First Minister and I both mentioned this bill that was being debated today, and coming out of that meeting I realised we'd passed the deadline for submitting amendments, but I was still keen to try, and we came up with the amendment that is in the order paper today, and it was then accepted by the Presiding Officer. The amendment seeks to provide complainers such as the Wilson family with the full resolution of their complaint. So to give an example of what they went through, they put in a complaint about a very senior officer within Police Scotland, and it was originally dismissed by Police Scotland. And the family clearly were not happy with that. So they went to PERC, and PERC said, actually, Police Scotland should look at this again. So the family went back to Police Scotland, and their complaints were upheld. When it was reinvestigated by the force, Police Scotland said, yes, the family were correct to put in this complaint, and their complaint was upheld. But they did not know the outcome of that complaint in terms of the misconduct against the officer and any sanctions applied to that officer. And for the family, when they explained this to the First Minister, they made it clear it was almost as bad not knowing if sanctions had been applied and what the sanctions were than it would have been when the original complaint was dismissed. They didn't feel they had the resolution they were looking for. And I spoke with Andrew and Veronica last night over email. And Andrew, I think, put it very well when he gave me this statement. And Andrew says this: "The amendment is hugely important for us as victims of the police complaint system, but also for anyone who has put a complaint in against the force. The fact that we don't know the outcome of our complaint and that the officer remains in post suggests a lack of justice and punishment, to the point that we don't know if our upheld complaint was taken serious or just brushed under the carpet." That's from a family who for over 20 years have suffered because the killer of their husband and father remains at large, and concerns they have against our force here in Scotland were originally dismissed, then upheld, but still they don't know the outcome of that. But Andrew also makes the point in his statement there that this is not just about Andrew and Veronica Wilson and their family. There are other victims who have been affected in the same way. And that's why I was very pleased that last night Victim Support Scotland wrote to all MSPs urging them to support this amendment. And they say it provides more transparency to victims of crime and families of bereaved by crime who have made complaints against police officers. And it provides people with information as to the outcome of their complaint, which is vital to ensuring the safety of those who made complaints. And I do welcome that from Police Scotland. Can I also say at this point, Presiding Officer, and I include you in this as a spokesperson for justice for your party, I'm extremely grateful to representatives of all the political parties who I contacted over the weekend about this amendment for the constructive way they entered into the discussions with me, and also to the Cabinet Secretary who at very short notice this morning met with me to discuss the amendment and the implications of the amendment. And I think what I picked up from many members I've spoken to is there is a desire to get to the bottom of this, to rectify the problems that the family have articulated now over many years, but particularly about this complaint with Police Scotland. But I also recognise, and I hold my hands up in my haste to get this manuscript amendment accepted and submitted, there are issues with it which I don't believe can be resolved today. It's never my intention, and I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary will go over this, it's never my intention to put any officers at risk for their names being made public if they shouldn't be made public. But I hope there's also a recognition that the system at the moment is not delivering for victims. It's clearly not delivering for Andrew and Veronica Wilson, and as Victim Support Scotland tell us in their briefing, it's not delivering for many of the victims they are dealing with on a daily basis. So I will listen to this debate, and I'll hear what others say. And before I come on to my next point that the Cabinet Secretary made this morning, I will give way to the convener of the Justice Committee.
Audrey Nicholl.
And I recognise the trauma that the family that the member has referenced in his comments have experienced. But I just wanted to put on the record the extent of scrutiny that was undertaken at stage 1 by the Criminal Justice Committee, and in particular the evidence of people with lived experience of the complaints and misconduct process, and things were not great, that's for sure, but it was just to make sure that the member was aware of that.
Douglas Ross.
I'm very much aware, and I would put on record my thanks, certainly as someone with an interest in this area, to the committee for their deliberations at Stage 1, at Stage 2 and again here today. There were representatives from Victim Support Scotland at the meeting with the First Minister that I sat in on last week, and they had also given evidence to Audrey Nicholl's committee at Stage 1. And I know that has been valuable in terms of the formulation of responses to where we've got to with the bill today. But another issue that I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary will mention is that perhaps my amendment would not be required because there is already provisions for this. And she mentioned this morning in our discussion, and I know in correspondence to the local MSP, who again, Fergus Ewing, I have to comment, has been extremely helpful to me since I lodged this amendment, and the work he has done for the Wilson family over many, many years, and that continues. But in response to both myself and Mr Ewing, the Cabinet Secretary mentions the statutory guidance from October 2020. And yes, at paragraph 150, it does go over what the resolution of complaints should look like for complainers, and it does say that the response to the complainers should contain details of any action taken to avoid the reoccurrence of the situation which gave rise to the complaint, including any learning or improvement action. And it also goes on to state that where misconduct proceedings have been taken, advise of the determination made of those proceedings and any disciplinary action ordered, if permitted by the applicable legislation. And I think it's that if permitted by the applicable legislation that led me to inserting this amendment, because I felt that was an opportunity to strengthen that applicable legislation. Because even though it is in black and white in that statutory guidance from 2022, it's clearly not working. We know from the example I have cited of the Wilson family, but of many other examples that have been advocated on victims' behalf by Victim Support Scotland and others, that element of the complaints process is not being delivered. We wouldn't be discussing this amendment today, and concerns from myself and I know others, if that was currently being delivered. So it would be interesting to hear during this debate what the Cabinet Secretary would say to that. Finally, Presiding Officer, my amendment is seeking to improve the complaints system. People don't complain against the police in normal circumstances unless they have good reason. And there is a growing frustration about the system of complaints against the police. That's partly why we have this legislation in front of us today. But not only is the legislation potentially not working, the system is not working because of the number of complaints or the lack of officers looking into this. And I want to cite examples, and I wrote to the Cabinet Secretary about this week. In the space of a few days, I've had 2 constituents contacting me, extremely concerned that in their view their complaints are not being treated seriously enough by the force. In one example, someone complained last summer and for months heard nothing, and that complaint has still not been allocated. More worryingly, I got a response yesterday from a constituent who received his 9th correspondence from Police Scotland about his complaint. His complaint was originally submitted in September 2023, and as of yesterday, he received a response from Professional Standards that said his case has not been determined, has not been allocated. Not even a Professional Standards officer even looking into his complaint yet, but it was submitted in September 2023, and on 9 separate occasions the force have taken the time to write to him or to email him to say that because of their workload pressures it's not been looked at yet, but to not even be allocated in well over a year, I think is indefensible. So I think we do need to see an improvement, and I hope those within Police Scotland who are following this debate and others will take on board that these complaints are serious to the complainer. They want a resolution, but they also believe they are being fobbed off and not taken seriously when these things lie on a desk, unchecked, unallocated for well over a year. So I do move the amendment in my name. I will listen with interest to what is said in this debate before finally deciding whether to press or not. And, Presiding Officer, could I also remind the Chamber of my register of interest that my wife is a serving officer with Police Scotland.
And now call Fergus Ewing.
Presiding Officer, it was on the 28th of November in the year 2004 that my constituent Alistair Wilson was shot to death on his own doorstep in his home in Nairn with the family inside the house. So for the last 20 years, the family have pursued a campaign for justice and have suffered unending grief, unimaginable for all of us here, or most of us here, I suspect. As the constituency MSP, I have worked with Veronica and the family for some years now and pursued certain concerns. And yesterday I spoke again to the family and agreed that this is what they wish me to say on their behalf today. They wish me to express their extreme disappointment that the Chief Constable of Scotland, the top police officer in the land, has thus far refused to meet with them. And they hope, Presiding Officer, that that is something that can be put right. Following my intervention with the Cabinet Secretary last year, the Lord Advocate met with the family and they heard at that meeting that there had been the most serious failures in the investigation, such, Presiding Officer, that a re-investigation has had to be ordered after 2 decades. A re-investigation that the family fear could take another 5 years. They did appreciate a Cabinet Secretary in the meeting with the Lord Advocate, who was honest and candid. But the requests thus far to meet the Chief Constable have not been agreed as yet. To quote Veronica Wilson herself, "I cannot believe how little information I'm given after a fight lasting 20 months in respect of the complaint, as we have heard from Mr Ross." Presiding Officer, surely the head of policing in Scotland should, as a matter of human decency and taking account of the tragedy befalling this family and the grief that they have suffered and continue to suffer, be willing to meet this family. I've always believed that the buck stops at the top, and the top person in every public body in Scotland is still a servant of the public. I hope that in her remarks the Cabinet Secretary can indicate a wish, if possible, that the Chief Constable should now meet with the family and see that they can get answers to the questions that thus far have eluded them. I won't repeat, Presiding Officer, the arguments Mr Ross has put. He has put them at length and very clearly. I was pleased to work with him and with yourself, Cabinet Secretary. I appreciate your letter this morning setting out technical reasons why the amendment may not work. I accept that they are valid reasons and therefore I wouldn't be minded to press this to a vote today. But I do think that Mr Ross is right, that the current system is patently not working as it should. And I do hope that you can further reflect on that and perhaps give members a clear indication that you will continue to look at these matters to try to improve the service for victims, especially of the most serious crimes in Scotland.
Thank you, Mr Ewing. And comments always through the Chair, of course. I call the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I just intimate, Presiding Officer, that I have some fairly detailed remarks around the proposition put forward by Mr Ross, and at the end of those more detailed remarks I will share some of my own reflections. But, Presiding Officer, I want to start by thanking Douglas Ross for his comments and also for the constructive meeting we have had this morning. I also want to put on record that the Government recognises the Wilson family have endured an unimaginable loss and that their anguish is compounded knowing that those responsible for their loved one's murder has not yet been brought to justice. And I also very much recognise the support that Mr Ross and Mr Ewan have given to the Wilson family. And as intimated by Mr Ewing, we have been in correspondence at length and have also spoken this morning also. As Mr Ross is aware, I cannot support this amendment, which would be a major policy development requiring proper consultation and consideration with partners that have helped develop and informed the bill. That doesn't mean that we won't have further reflections on what is next. But before explaining the Government's position in detail, I want to reassure Mr Ross and Mr Ewan and all members that a lot of what Mr Ross is seeking to do with this amendment is already largely dealt with in the existing provision in a combination of primary and secondary legislation and in statutory guidance. The Police, Public Order and Criminal Justice Scotland Act 2006 requires Police Scotland and the Scottish Police Authority to have regard to the statutory guidance issued by the Police Investigations and Review Commissioner. While the guidance applies to Police Scotland and the authority, it also applies to other policing bodies operating in Scotland, whereas this amendment does not. The statutory guidance provides a detailed list of what a complaint response should contain and with appropriate safeguards. And it is the lack of those safeguards that concerns me most about Mr Ross's amendment. The amendment would mean that Police Scotland, the Scottish Police Authority and the Police Investigations and Review Commissioner would be compelled to provide the names of any officer involved in a complaint, the outcomes and other information, no matter the possible sensitivity of that information, even if that complaint was false, and that information could then fall into the public domain. It provides for no exceptions to the disclosure of the officer's name and outcome. Officers can be subject of malicious or false complaints, and this would provide more ammunition to those with malign intent to make complaints about unnamed officers in order to find out the identity of these officers. And officers, as we all know, undertake very difficult and in some cases very sensitive, dangerous roles, and this amendment could lead officers to be vulnerable to exploitation or, more worryingly, physical harm. The amendment would also force disclosure of any information whatsoever sought by the complainer about the complaint. This could include the identity of other complainers who have complained about the same matter and might be read to include other highly sensitive information about members of the public or indeed victims or witnesses of a crime. There is no ability to refuse unless not reasonably practicable, but that is a test which does not allow a judgment to be made about the lawfulness or appropriateness of disclosing the information sought. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government has engaged with the Police Investigations and Review Commissioner on this, and they have serious and grave concerns about being compelled to share Police Scotland and officers' information and the potential legal implications of this. We have also sought views from Police Scotland and His Majesty Chief Inspector of Constabulary, and they have said that there are a series of circumstances in which it is not safe to reveal the name of an officer, including when dealing with organised crime groups or work within specialist units such as firearms. The amendment does not take any cognizance of this, and indeed I would have concerns that such a blunt requirement without any safeguarding provisions risks being contrary to the European Convention on Human Rights. Supporting this amendment would therefore come with significant risk, and as I've said earlier, I can reassure Parliament that there is already a process in place around complainants being told the outcome of their complaints. Of course.
Douglas Ross.
I recognise what the Cabinet Secretary is saying. How, therefore, does she view the fact that we have a family and others who are clearly telling us, despite this being in place, they are not getting the information they require? They have been through this process. An officer has been found guilty of misconduct, but they are not being told any sanctions applied to that officer.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, can I reassure Mr Ross and other members, and appreciate that there are patients involved here. I will get to some specific actions that I've taken forward today in response to the very specific concerns on the cases that Mr Ross has raised with me. But can I also point to some of the improvements that this bill will make, particularly in and around extending the powers and scope of the PIRC. So the PIRC will be able to call in an investigation of a relevant complaint. The PIRC will be able to carry out complaint handling reviews of their own volition, and the PIRC will be able to make recommendations about individual complaint handling reviews and called in complaints, and Police Scotland and the SPA will need to respond to these, resulting in better transparency about how it is dealt with when the PIRC suggests improvements. And there is also the transfer of certain functions from the SPA to the PIRC as well, and I'm sure we'll discuss more of these measures later on this afternoon. If I could just perhaps address some of my remarks to how matters should be dealt with in accordance with the statutory guidance, and then I will share some detail on further action. The statutory guidance requires that the names of officers involved in the complaint are provided. Importantly, unlike the proposed amendment, the guidance provides an exception to this, where identification would pose a risk to the officer, in which case unique identification numbers are regarded as sufficient. Where misconduct proceedings have been taken, Police Scotland advise of the determination made at those proceedings and any disciplinary action ordered if permitted by the relevant secondary legislation. I can also provide the assurance that this guidance applies to details of all individuals, whether constables, staff or special constables, whereas Amendment 28 would only apply to officers. Police Scotland, the authority and the PIRC are subject to freedom of information legislation, and individuals have the right to access and receive a copy of their personal data and other supplementary information. And consideration is also given in appropriate cases to explaining the outcome of the complaint personally to the complainer prior to the issuing of the final response. And this strikes the balance between transparency and legal data protections. And the SPA Complaints and Conduct Committee scrutinise that performance and hold Police Scotland to account where the proper balance is not being achieved. And of course, that also speaks to the importance of personal contact, particularly where matters are complex and so serious. And in response to Mr Ewan's direct questions to me, he has articulated the family's wishes to meet with the Chief Constable. And while Chamber and Mr Ewan would not expect me to abuse my position as Justice Secretary by making requests or orders that are not appropriate to me, but let me just share some of my own reflections. I always come to this from the view as Justice Secretary that irrespective of how difficult engagements are, they are, nonetheless important, and on balance tend to be more helpful than not. And Mr Ewan cited the example of the Lord Advocate, and our Lord Advocate has, I believe, a good track record of meeting victims and families, notwithstanding that she has very prescribed and distinct roles around her independence. And I also believe that the First Minister very often leads by example on this too, because he, as we all know, is a man that's scrupulous about things being done properly, and, you know, as a former member of the Justice Committee, is very respectful and cognisant of the independent role and functions of different individuals and agencies within our justice system. But he also manages, while respecting independence role and functions, to be very open to engaging with families, and particularly families and individuals who have experienced considerable distress and who have underwent, you know, some of the most traumatic and serious experiences that would be beyond the experience of most of us. And it is important, in my view, in my personal view, that for all of us, that we, you know, extend the hand of engagement, particularly with those whose experience is beyond our own. And it's important that in this chamber that none of us have any blind spots. In terms of the specifics matters in terms of the amendments, in summary, I just want to say, Presiding Officer, where a person complains about the police, the name of the officer or police staff can be shared. It is standard practice to inform of outcomes and communicate clearly any service failings identified, and members of the public are informed of outcomes of misconduct proceedings if these have arisen from a complaint. Now, I am very mindful, again, without me, you know, casting any judgment or stepping into a space that I shouldn't, that Mr Ross has narrated experiences of others that are perhaps inconsistent or certainly seem to be inconsistent with the PERC statutory guidance. So, Presiding Officer, following my constructive meeting with Mr Ross this morning to discuss the amendment, I would like to confirm to him and to Chamber that I have taken on board the concerns he has raised on behalf of the Wilson family and the case study in the Victim Support Scotland briefing. And I have written to Police Scotland and the PERC today to set out concerns that have been shared with me and to seek their assurances that Police Scotland follows the PERC statutory guidance at all times, in particular with respect to communicating outcomes to the complainer, and that any exceptions are wholly justified. And I will also raise the issue in my next meeting with the Chief Constable, which will occur very shortly. So, Presiding Officer, thank you for your indulgence. I hope that this provides Mr Ewan, Mr Ross and Chamber as a whole with assurance as to the seriousness in which I take these matters, and that Chamber will accept my reassurances, and that Mr Ross, I hope, will not press Amendment 28. Thank you.
Thank you. I call on Douglas Ross to wind up press to withdraw Amendment 28. Mr Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I thank Fergus Ewing for his contribution and the Cabinet Secretary for the detail that she provided, and also, as I'll come on to in a moment, the very positive response she gave at the end. Can I repeat what I said in my opening remarks? I accept the shortcomings in the amendment that I submitted. I think in time to come it may be used as an example of why people should meet deadlines and get appropriate parliamentary committee scrutiny of their amendments, but I hope also the Chamber will understand, as I sought to explain to the representatives doing justice for each of the parties, the reason why this one came in so late, and in particular that the family wanted to have their meeting with the First Minister before taking things further. I accept what the Justice Secretary has said in terms of the unintended consequences of the amendment should it pass, but I am also extremely grateful and genuinely grateful to the effort she has taken since just this morning to contact PERC and Police Scotland about clearly shortcomings for some complainants and victims of crime that has an impact on them, not just in the short term, but as is the case with the Wilson family, as Fergus Ewing articulated, over 20 months that this complaint was being looked looked at, reviewed and reinvestigated, and to still feel that it is unresolved because they don't know the final outcome. So I do very much welcome that from the Justice Secretary. On Fergus Ewing's speech, I didn't mention it in my opening remarks, but in summing up, I could not agree more with Fergus Ewing in the way he has outlined the inaction by Scotland's Chief Constable. I cannot understand the thought process of the most senior police officer in Scotland, someone with significant experience at high level, both here and in forces in England, who can see a high-profile case that has been one of Scotland's most talked about and long-running murder investigations in our history, to continue to refuse to meet with Veronica and Andrew and members of the Wilson family. And those of us who have been privileged to sit in on meetings with Andrew and Veronica will know they are constructive, they are determined to get justice, but they also just want answers. And I don't think that is an unacceptable request for people who have been waiting decades for those answers. Remember, Veronica opened the door to the killer. Andrew still speaks about the image that he had. He was just a toddler at the time. They have been through unimaginable pain and suffering. And I think that is being extended by a callous approach of Scotland's Chief Constable to continue to refuse to meet with them. Indeed, I wrote again last year following a meeting with Veronica, urging the Chief Constable to respond, and I got a letter back just before Christmas, and it still annoys me, that the Chief Constable couldn't even be bothered to give the pretence that she had looked at this herself. She couldn't even add an electronic signature. She got one of her deputies to sign the letter. I mean, I don't know what she's thinking, but I do hope that people at Tully Allen and someone in the Chief Constable's office is watching today. They have heard the strong advocacy for the family from Fergus Ewing and heard the comments from the Justice Secretary, who I think, staying within the confines of her office, is urging the Chief Constable to look at this. If the head of the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service in Scotland, the Lord Advocate, can meet with the family, if the head of the Scottish Government, the First Minister, can meet with the family, surely the head of Police Scotland can also meet with the family. So once again, can I thank Fergus Ewing for his contribution, can I thank all the party representatives who engaged with me over this, and can I genuinely thank the Justice Secretary for her meeting this morning and for the constructive way she will take forward the issues that I have raised, and confirm, Presiding Officer, I will not be pressing this motion.
Thank you. Mr Ross seeks to withdraw Amendment 28. Does any member object? No member objects. Therefore, Amendment 28 is withdrawn. We now move to Group 7, Complaint Handling Reviews. I call Amendment 8 in the name of Sharon Dowie and a group of its own. Sharon Dowie to move and speak to Amendment 8.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. If an individual who has made a complaint against the police is unhappy with the way the complaint has been handled, they can request that PIRC, the Police Investigation and Review Commissioner, conduct a complaint handling review. This legislation expands this aspect of the complaints procedure to allow the Commissioner themselves to conduct a complaint handling review if they think it is appropriate, rather than having to rely on the complainer to bring this to PIRC. I successfully amended this section in Stage 2, requiring PIRC to notify the relevant complainer that they have decided to conduct a complaint handling review, and I'm glad the Scottish Government agreed with me on this issue. However, my Stage 2 amendment only focused on the new powers granted to PIRC to conduct a complaint handling review of their own volition. It was my understanding that if PIRC decided to review a case at the request of a complainer, the complainer would be notified. But this is not the case, largely due to a defect in existing legislation. Therefore, my amendment number 8 attempts to fix this by ensuring that the complainer is equally notified if a complaint handling review is taking place, regardless of who requested it, be it the complainers or PIRC themselves. This will ensure the complainer is, in every case, made aware that the PIRC is going to review the handling of their complaint, keeping them informed and allowing them to be engaged with the review. This is a very simple amendment that I hope the Parliament can support, and I press the amendment in my name.
Thank you very much. And I call the Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, again, I'm pleased to have been able to work with Ms Dowie on this amendment, which is subsequent to an amendment she brought forward at Stage 2 to place a duty on the PIRC to notify the relevant complainer that a decision has been made to carry out a complaint handling review of the Park's own volition. I supported that amendment and the policy intention of requiring the Park to notify the complainer of any decision to carry out a complaint handling review, regardless of how that has come about, in order to make the complainer aware the Park is going ahead with a review. Amendment 8 will ensure that the complainer is, in every case, made aware that the Park is going to review the handling of their complaint, keeping them informed and allowing them to be engaged with the review, and therefore I ask members to support Amendment 8.
Thank you. Calling Sharon Dowie to wind up. Press to withdraw Amendment 8. Ms Dowie.
Thank you. Can I just take this opportunity to thank the legislation team, the Cabinet Secretary and the Government officials for their help in working with the amendments at stage 2 to bring them in at stage 3 and get them passed. And I move the amendment in my name. Pass.
Sure.
Move it.
And we press it. Yeah. The question is that Amendment 8 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is agreed. I call Amendment 2 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 1. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 2 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is agreed. I call Amendment 3 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 1. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
Thank you. The question is Amendment 3 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is agreed. And we now move to Group 8, the PERC review of practices and policies. And I call Amendment 9 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, in a group of its own. Cabinet Secretary to move and speak to Amendment 9.
Presiding Officer, the bill gives the Police Investigation Review Commissioner a new power to review a policy or practice of the police where the Park considers it is in the public interest to do so. It also provides the Park with protection from legal actions for defamation in relation to statements made in the course of this new function. However, the same protections are not currently in place for those persons making statements to the Park when the Park is carrying out this new function, and this amendment will ensure those protections are put in place. If such protections are absent for those making statements to the Park, there would be a concern that this would affect the information provided to the Park in conducting this new function, to the detriment of the ability to report and provide recommendations. Therefore, after consultation with the Park on this matter, I propose this amendment to allow absolute privilege to protect those persons making statements to the Park against defamation in relation to the Park's new function, to review and make recommendations about practices and policies of the police as set out in section 15 of the bill. This amendment will ensure that the law is consistent in terms of the protections from actions for defamation contained within the 2006 Police, Public Order and Criminal Justice Scotland Act. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. No other members have asked to speak. Cabinet Secretary, anything to add by way of wind-up?
Nothing.
No. The question is that Amendment 9 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament is agreed. I call Amendment 27 in the name of Polly McNeill, already debated with Amendment 12. Polly McNeill to move or not move?
Not moved.
That amendment is not moved, and that ends Stage 3 amendments. As members will be aware, the Presiding Officer is required under standing orders to decide whether or not, in her view, any provision of the bill relates to a protected subject matter, that is whether it modifies the electoral system and franchise for Scottish parliamentary elections. In the case of this bill, it is the Presiding Officer's view no provision of the Police Ethics, Conduct and Scrutiny Scotland bill relates to a protected subject matter. Therefore, the bill does not require a supermajority to pass at stage 3. And before we move to the next item of business, there will be a brief pause.
The next item of business is a debate on motion 16093, in the name of Angela Constance on Police, Ethics, Conduct and Scrutiny Scotland Bill. I'd be grateful if members who wish to speak in the debate were to press their request to speak buttons now. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary to speak to and move the motion. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, I'm very pleased to open the debate on the Police Ethics, Conduct and Scrutiny Scotland Bill. I express my thanks to the committees that took part in considering the bill, particularly the Criminal Justice Committee members for their detailed scrutiny and gathering a wide range of views in written and oral evidence. And of course, have to thank the clerks to the Criminal Justice Committee also. I would also like to thank everyone who has engaged with the committee and the government during the development and passage of the bill. I want to say a very special thank you to those with lived experience of the police complaints and misconduct systems for their testimony, which was instrumental in developing the bill. And also to Lady Elish, whose recommendations formed the basis for the bill. And I also want to make particular mention and express my particular thanks to my bill team for their excellent support throughout the passage of the bill. Presiding Officer, Police Scotland officers and staff work tirelessly to protect and support our communities. And I want to reiterate how much I value the hard work and dedication of our police officers who conduct themselves with integrity and professionalism and the whole policing workforce. The principle of policing by consent is central to the mutual bonds of trust between the public and the police. So it is of the utmost importance that the public have confidence in our police service. We need to have trust that those who serve in the police continue to fulfil the very high standards of behaviour and conduct that we expect right throughout their careers. It is therefore essential that there are robust, clear and transparent mechanisms in place to investigate complaints or other issues of concern about the police. And if things go wrong, the police must be held to account and lessons should be learned and improvements made. The bill has 4 main purposes. Those are to raise and embed the ethical standards of the police service, to strengthen the statutory framework on vetting, to reform how police misconduct is dealt with, and finally to broaden the role of the Police Investigation and Review Commissioner and therefore provide greater independent scrutiny of police complaint handling in Scotland. The bill cannot be viewed in isolation, though. It is a further step on the journey of transformative change that has been delivered since the former Lord Advocate Dame Elish Angelini's independent review of complaint handling, investigations and misconduct issues in relation to policing in Scotland. And I will highlight some specific provisions that have the potential to bring about real and lasting change. The bill enables the Scottish Police Barred List and the Police Advisory List, which will capture information about police constables who have or who are suspected of having engaged in serious misconduct, which can then be shared as appropriate. Presiding Officer, there is a strong public interest in dealing with allegations of gross misconduct after officers leave the service. The bill will ensure a conclusion is reached, and if that conclusion is that the officer would have been dismissed had they still been an officer, then the person will be added to the barred list. The list will improve police integrity, increase accountability of those who are dismissed from policing and support police vetting right across the UK. Presiding Officer, the bill also puts a statutory obligation on the Chief Constable to prepare, regularly review and disseminate a code of ethics. There are extensive consultation requirements for the development and the maintenance of the code, reinforcing its significance and embeds a human rights-based approach to policing. Every person who holds the office of constable and has the powers of that office has a higher duty to account for their own actions and the actions of others that they have witnessed in the execution of their duties. Therefore, the explicit duty of candour on constables and also on Police Scotland as an organisation is another significant provision in the bill. Several features will strengthen the role of the Police Investigations and Review Commissioner, including the power to take over the consideration of complaints that are being dealt with by the Chief Constable or the Scottish Police Authority, and the transfer of certain functions from the authority to the PERC. Taken together, these provisions strengthen independent scrutiny of the police complaints and misconduct systems. I have been open to making improvements to the bill throughout the process while maintaining a firm focus on what it seeks to achieve, and the committee's significant recommendation that the bill should include a power for the Chief Constable to remove someone who is unable to maintain their vetting was delivered at stage 2. As stated in the recent letter to the Criminal Justice Committee, His Majesty's Chief Inspector of Constabulary reminded us that putting vetting on a statutory footing was vital and will ensure, and I quote, that all officers and staff meet and sustain the standards required and that the public are served by a workforce that they can trust. Presiding Officer, I also want to thank members who have engaged with me throughout the passage of the bill to make improvements at each stage. That includes Sharon Dowie, whose amendment ensures that the voices of victims, survivors, witnesses or suspects and accused have the opportunity to be heard as consultees in preparing the Code of Ethics. And also her amendment to create a one-off duty on the Chief Constable to review and make changes to the policies, procedures and guidance that relate to the discipline and in light of the Code of Ethics. Katie Clark's amendments increase transparency by obliging the Chief Constable to explain reasons either for not revising the code or, in the case where it is revised, why particular representations made by mandatory consultees did not result in a change. And this will assure both officers and the public that the code is keeping pace with ethical standards. Presiding Officer, the bill will ensure that the police complaints and misconduct systems are fairer, more transparent, accountable and proportionate, which will ultimately help to strengthen public confidence in policing in Scotland. And I move that Parliament agrees that the Police Ethics, Conduct and Scrutiny Scotland Bill be passed. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now call on Sharon Dowie. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Conservatives will vote for this bill today, believing it will improve the complaints system process for members of the public and for police officers themselves. I acknowledge there are still some concerns, not least from the Scottish Police Federation, about certain elements, and it is important that we all work with them in future to ensure these can be resolved as best as possible. There appears to be widespread agreement that the current system fails both victims and the police. That is why we have worked hard on this bill, successfully tabling a number of amendments to make sure it is as fair and robust as it possibly can be. There is no shortage of examples of people who have been let down by the system, and I am sure we will hear many of these during today's debate. But it is also worth remembering that this bill aims to protect police officers to the same extent. Both as a regional MSP and working in a justice-related portfolio, I see every single day the sheer selflessness of police officers as they go about their work of keeping us safe. When they go to work each day, they have absolutely no idea what they are going to face, or indeed if they have a guarantee of returning home safely at the end of their shift. Often they arrive at an incident and are forced to deal with a whole series of events over which they have little control. They have no responsibility or opportunity to deal with the minutes or hours leading up to an incident, or even the weeks, months and years of chaos in someone's lives, which lead them requiring the intervention of the law. They are sometimes themselves victims of vexatious complaints, often by some of the very worst people in society. And when that happens, as unions repeatedly point out, they are guilty until proven innocent. That can mean being suspended or put in restricted duties, something that can be hugely damaging to someone's career, their confidence, self-esteem and mental health. And with policing numbers being as low as they are, when officers are increasingly being called to incidents which are arguably outside their remit, society can hardly afford to have innocent, hard-working policemen and women being forced off duty for no good reason. So I have huge sympathy with the Scottish Police Federation and the concerns they have raised about vetting and the harm done to officers when they are incorrectly accused of wrongdoing. That said, as SPF said on a number of occasions, police rank and file are merely a reflection of our own society. In a 16,000+ workforce, which of course replenishes regularly over time, it would be foolish to assume that every single employee is perfect. So we need to make sure when misconduct does occur, it is dealt with swiftly and to the satisfaction of the complainer. I know that police officers themselves are as keen for this to happen as anyone. Presiding Officer, this has been a very important piece of legislation and one that has involved good cooperation between all parties involved. It hasn't fallen victim to party politics or petty point-scoring exchanges and has been a bill which everyone can see the good motivation behind. It is crucial that we ensure we pass good law here in the Scottish Parliament and that when legislation is introduced, those who are tasked with enforcing it are sufficiently resourced in order to do so. I hope that the Scottish Government works with Police Scotland to ensure the finances are right, especially during a phase where the senior leadership of Police Scotland is regularly forced to raise concern about resources, financial planning and long-term security of the force. On a personal level, I was pleased to secure 5 amendments to this bill at stage 2, which I'll briefly summarise for the record. Firstly, that PIRC will immediately notify a complainer when it decides to conduct a complaint handling review, something which is straightforward and will improve their experience within the process. Then, that the Chief Constable makes appropriate changes in light of the Code of Ethics as soon as possible. After all, what is the use of this if it sits on a shelf without ever being enacted? In addition, we should ensure that disciplinary proceedings cannot be brought against an officer more than a year after they have resigned or retired. This will ensure stale proceedings cannot be pursued after an unreasonable amount of time has passed. This particular amendment would not prevent criminal proceedings being brought in relation to historic allegations. Yet it is also important officers are fully aware of the situation and shouldn't be allowed to resign simply because they think it will get them off the hook. A police officer must be informed at the earliest opportunity if such a situation arises, that leaving the force does not safeguard them in the event of proceedings being launched. And finally, when the Chief Constable is preparing a code of ethics, to ensure that among the many groups and organisations likely to be consulted, people who have made complaints in the past are also included. Lived experience in this case will be essential. There are considerable concerns around the vetting amendments which come in at stage 2, not least because no evidence was taken on it. That is not a good way to make law, and the committee was split on whether or not it should proceed. The fear that it could be used as an excuse to dismiss officers rather than purely to address misconduct is entirely legitimate. There are many good points in the bill, but these specific concerns must be placed on the record. And to conclude, Presiding Officer, I am pleased to vote for this bill and fully believe it will be of benefit to the public and the hard-working police officers who sacrifice so much to keep the streets of Scotland safe. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now call on Pauline McNeill. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Scottish Labour believes that we must act to ensure the highest standards in our police force. It is the power held by police officers and police organisations that require the right structures and standards to ensure that we can have confidence in our policing. Measures in the bill seek to introduce robust mechanisms to address unacceptable conduct and behaviours of a minority of police officers and staff. I too would like to thank all the witnesses and victims who spoke up and gave the Criminal Justice Committee first-hand evidence of how police processes can impact on their lives, and also to my colleagues on the Justice Committee, the Bill team and our clerks, who worked very hard to give a constructive Stage 1 report. But the bill can't be viewed in isolation and is only a part of a wider piece of work that has to be done to improve police complaints and conduct systems. The Code of Ethics and the duty of candour won't have any particular legal effect, but it does set out the expectations. There was quite a lot of debate on this, particularly from victims' organisations such as Victim Support, who wanted the code to be more transparent and publicly available, and that there would be consequences of those breaches. But what we're clear about is that the Code of Ethics should be robust and reflect the challenges of modern policing, and the committee in its report asked to be able to review the draft code. Separately from that, there's the duty of candour, a separate standard requirement to assist in investigations, and it's not only the same as following any other duty or order, but is of a different and more serious fundamental nature. Some caution was advised by some witnesses on whether the duty of candour extends to circumstances that happen off duty, but that has been clear in the process that it will do. But that will not cut across the right of an accused person, whether it's a police officer or a member of police staff, not to self-incriminate in criminal inquiries. I think it's fair to put on the record that the Scottish Police Federation's view was that they did not think that duty was necessary, as 99.9% of officers in any case do cooperate when asked to do so in the course of any inquiries. Now, one of the critical matters for the committee and for Scottish Labour was the financial memorandum. In fact, we couldn't have supported the bill if the government hadn't corrected this. Now, as early as this morning, we heard again from PERC in relation to other matters, but they reiterated the financial implications of legislative decisions are quite important to consider. They still remain opposed to taking on responsibility of presenting cases against senior officers, not just from a financial point of view, but also the process itself. To quote, they don't think that they should be judge and jury. So there are still things in the bill that I think are problematic, but because of the elements within the bill that we do support, for that reason we will be supporting this evening. And I hope we can get a full update at a later point in the Parliament as to how this is all proceeding. One of the biggest issues of the bill in itself is that I don't think it's is not transformative in the way that the public might have liked. I don't know if they will notice any real difference in the handling of complaints, nor will it allow any new avenues for families of victims to raise concern about police inquiries. I raised the specific question of the Emma Caldwell inquiry. If a family had some concerns about the avenue being pursued, there isn't really a route for that. So there's a lot of work to be done here, that's pretty clear. The introduction of the barred list, I think, is a very important aspect of the bill. It does seem a lifetime ago that the committee examined the issue of the length of time that cases take involving police officers to come to court. And the committee, I think, did a good job in trying to thrash out why that was. I had a good session with Lady Angelini about that. And I think that it's contained within the Stage 1 report that we've hopefully come to a conclusion here that the criminal allegations against the police division known as CAPD in the Crown Office responsible for the investigation of criminal complaints has said they do expect to meet 75% of cases within 6 months going forward. So let's see if that does actually happen. I fully supported the amendments in Sharon Dowie's name. I think were really important to ensure that whilst we've introduced this new provision to pursue officers after they leave the service, it's not a completely open-ended timescale, in all fairness. I won't reiterate what I've said about the vetting provisions which apply to police officers and staff, but I emphasise that the power of the Chief Constable to dismiss officers and staff who do not maintain their vetting was agreed at the Stage 1 report before we had sight of the detail of the vetting provisions. And who knows what view we might have taken of that power. But it's because the Chief Constable now has that power with the new vetting provisions, we need to be clear that we have a balance here in fairness. I want to put on record that I think that the government accepting my Amendment 17 in relation to written reasons, I think is really important. I think that it will add a substantial balance of fairness for police officers who do think they should get to know why their vetting has been refused. The only remaining concern, as I said, in the vetting groupings is I still think, in principle, we should be clear that there should be a right of correction or appeal. However, in conclusion, Presiding Officer, I did take a lot from what the Cabinet Secretary had to say in those groupings about the discussions that we'll expect to happen between the police organisations and those representing police unions and staff, and I hope in those discussions we can thrash out something that everyone feels is a fair conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now call on Maggie Chapman. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to open the Stage 3 debate on behalf of the Scottish Greens and to support the Police Ethics, Conduct and Scrutiny Scotland Bill. I want to thank everyone who has worked on this bill, including the committee members, clerks and researchers, those who have given such valuable evidence, and the successive Cabinet Secretaries with whom I've had such positive and fruitful conversations. I thank all of those organisations and groups who have sent in briefings, or with whom I've had very helpful conversations over the course of this bill's passage. But most of all, I want to thank those people who have shared their own personal stories so bravely and generously. Stephanie Bonner lost her firstborn child, her son, Rhys, when he was only 19. That is more than enough grief for anyone to bear. But the pain of his death was multiplied by the failure of Police Scotland to investigate it properly, the betrayal of the lies she was told, the way in which her simplest questions were met with what she describes as a wall of silence, and the 4 years which it took to just get through the complaints process. Nothing we do today can redress those wrongs. Her questions have never been answered. She doesn't even know where to lay her flowers. What we can do, though, is honour Rhys's memory and Stephanie's courage and her compassion, for she does what few would be prepared to do. She speaks not only for herself, but for all those who have experienced the pain and betrayal of police failures and the obstruction and intimidation that are used to defend the indefensible. Others too, including Magdalene Robertson and Bill Johnston, have generously shared their own terrible experiences to help develop and scrutinise the work of this bill. We stand in gratitude, admiration and respect. Our society and the legislation passed in this and other places gives an extraordinary range and depth of power to its police officers. That power can be misused in the most horrific ways. This bill before us today was instigated by the work of Lady Eilish Angelini. It represents one strand of response to the recommendations of her report on the police complaint system, which was published in 2020. But between that report and the introduction of this bill, she was called upon to chair another inquiry into a crime which prompted grief and rage across the United Kingdom and the world. Sarah Everard was a young woman of 33 when she was raped and murdered by an elite Metropolitan Police officer in an act of premeditated and deliberate femicide. She was murdered because she was a woman, because he was a misogynist predator, and because the recruitment, vetting and management processes which should have recognised his utter unsuitability for any position of power were broken or non-existent. Like Stephanie Bonner, Sarah Everard's relatives have been heroic and selfless in their determination to bring about change, to shine a light on that culture of misogyny, those institutional failures, the lack of attention, of foresight, of care. Those failures are perhaps especially evident in the Metropolitan Police, but no force, including Police Scotland, is entirely free of them. Not only misogyny, but racism and other forms of discrimination are embedded deep in institutional cultures, attitudes and processes. That fact has been acknowledged at the highest levels. And that is why, Presiding Officer, I want to end by remembering Sheku Bayo and reiterating my sorrow, sympathy and solidarity with his family as they endure their own long wait for answers and accountability. For the work we do here this afternoon can only bear fruit if it is part of a wider endeavour, that of transforming our systems, challenging our institutions and making genuine, open and accessible justice a reality for us all. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now call on Liam MacArthur. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I add my thanks to the committee and those that gave evidence. Thanks too to Lady Eilish for laying the foundations for the important and necessary reforms we're debating as part of this bill. Of course, the vast majority of police officers conduct themselves with the utmost integrity and work tirelessly to keep people and communities across Scotland safe. They do so at a time where the demands placed upon them, the challenges they face, are growing ever greater. And I was privileged to witness at the Federation Awards last month the commitment, selflessness and bravery shown day and daily by officers around the country, which is truly humbling. At the same time, to protect those in its service and those it serves, policing requires officers and staff to adopt the most stringent of ethics codes. Service in the force, while uniquely challenging, also provides a unique degree of power over fellow citizens. When that power is abused or misused, accountability and transparency are paramount. And too often at present, that does not appear to be the case, and victims are often felt left feeling shut out from the complaint system. So Scottish Liberal Democrats welcome this bill and the efforts made to provide clear regulatory framework, more robust vetting procedures, to increase the scrutiny role of independent bodies and the strengthening of the consequences of that misconduct. The Angelini report emphasised the need for a proactive approach as well as the open and frank debate around the state of Scottish policing. And let's not forget there are currently 2,000 unresolved complaints against members of the police force, and 1,200 of these are yet to even be allocated an investigation, a point I think Douglas Ross made in relation to his amendment. So I welcome the approach of the Justice Committee, of the Justice Secretary and the Justice Committee in consulting with those with lived experience of the complaint system, both civilians and those on the police side. Can I commend and congratulate Sharon Dowie and Katie Clark for the amendments they've had accepted today, and also actually welcome the moves by Pauline McNeill to air a debate that I think needed to be had around the vetting system. I think we accept the need for that vetting, but I think there are genuine and reasonable misgivings about how that might be used inappropriately, and I think the debate that we've been able to have today has been worthwhile. So I thank Pauline McNeill for allowing that to happen. I would echo Victim Support Scotland's assessment, though, that it's not enough simply to have procedures in place that deal reactively with those who violate the Code of Ethics or engage in misconduct. Periodic vetting procedures provide scope for proactive scrutiny and I think reflect the intentions of the Angelini report in that regard. But yeah, I do indeed recognise the concerns raised by the Federation, by ASPS with myself in a meeting earlier this morning, and I think it is an issue that we will need to keep under review, but I welcome the reassurances and clarifications offered by the Cabinet Secretary in response to those amendments. As she said, policing by consent demands the highest ethical standards are upheld. Public trust must see, for the public to have trust, it must see and feel that systems are in place which are designed to protect them should they encounter misconduct. I think the points made by Douglas Ross in speaking to his amendment indicate there are still gaps there, and I think the exchange with the Cabinet Secretary there was very helpful. But on the whole, I believe this is a bill that takes us much closer to that point, and therefore Scottish Liberal Democrats will be voting in favour of the bill at decision time this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. We now move to the open debate, and I call Audrey Nicholl to be followed by Jamie Green.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And while I'm not speaking this afternoon in my capacity as convener of the Criminal Justice Committee, I do want to put on record my thanks to my committee colleagues and the Cabinet Secretary for their commitment to effectively scrutinising this bill and bringing forward a range of constructive amendments. So the Police Ethics, Conduct and Scrutiny Bill outlines a range of provisions at the heart of which is ensuring strong and transparent processes to investigate complaints and allegations of misconduct involving police officers and certain police staff. And the vast majority of police officers and staff are absolutely dedicated and honest and do an incredibly difficult job. A key objective of the bill is to ensure public trust and confidence when something goes wrong. A complaint that will be taken seriously and dealt with in a timely manner. And this came across loud and clear during stage 1, when the committee took evidence from members of the public who had made complaint to either Police Scotland or to PERC, and we also heard from an officer who was the subject of a complaint. And much of their evidence demonstrated the profound impact that the shortfalls in complaints handling had had on them. And it was clear, when the standard of behaviour of officers and staff falls short, there must be accountability. And in that regard, one issue which I am pleased the bill addresses is to enable gross misconduct proceedings to continue or commence when a person ceases to be a constable. And I'm pleased that this has developed further through stages 2 and 3. Stage 2 saw detailed debate across the provisions of the bill, including on vetting code of practice, which was subject of extensive amendments this afternoon. And I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's detailed rationale for the vetting code of practice. This was very welcome. No one doubts the importance of a vetting process for officers and staff. However, this provision was a clear recommendation contained in the HMI Assurance Review of vetting policy and procedures. And concerns about today's amendments were clearly set out by HMICS and Police Scotland in their respective correspondence to the Criminal Justice Committee on the 9th of January. And as the HMIC set out in his report, historically vetting has been used to reduce corruption, with the focus being on the protection of police information and assets. So losing intelligence to serious and organised criminals, for example, the harm to vulnerable people, damage to public confidence and the reputation of the police service can be considerable and undermines colleagues and the communities they serve. Vetting policy is absolutely fundamental to reducing risk, but importantly, the application of a code of practice must be robust and effective. Briefly on Amendment 28 lodged by Douglas Ross, I absolutely understand the spirit of the amendment with regard to transparency of process that Mr Ross set out very clearly and the shortcomings within that process. My concerns, should the amendment have been moved and accepted, would have been with regard to the absence of consultation, which Mr Ross recognised, and the potential safety risks associated with the provision of personal information and associated risk whereby that information found its way into the public domain. And I'm confident that was not the intention of the amendment. I'm pleased the Cabinet Secretary set out a very detailed response in that regard. So to conclude, this bill places a range of additional provisions that will bring greater scrutiny and transparency to the handling of complaints and allegations of misconduct, and I would urge members to accept the bill, to support the bill at stage 3. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now call Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. When I spoke in the Stage 1 debate on this bill, I reiterated the point that's already been made today, that we police by consent in Scotland, and that is a value that I think we ought to cherish, because it can never be taken for granted. Of course, we all expect the highest standards of everybody in our police service, and of course we know that for some that trust has been well and truly broken. But equally, I make this point, that passing laws which are born out of some virtuous desire to root out malpractice or to fix procedural failures should never be done in a way which undermines greater morale amongst serving officers. Nor should any such legislation be used as a legislative loophole which seeks to remove unwanted characters from the force itself, where conduct is not really the issue, but personality too often is. Callum Steele didn't mince his words, Cabinet Secretary, when criticising this bill in today's Herald. Look, I don't necessarily agree with everything that he wrote in his article, but he made some pretty prickly points. The loss of public confidence in Police Scotland, in his view, is thanks largely to a lack of training and organisational negligence. In his view, a litany of leadership issues have created the perfect environment for declining standards in Police Scotland, compounded, of course, by the fact that officers with limited experience are now serving as mentors to their peers and new recruits. When I stood on this front bench as Shadow Justice Secretary, I recall on numerous occasions raising the very issue that a loss of expertise in the higher ranks of Police Scotland would lead to newer and far less experienced officers making judgments which others might not have. And that's all against, of course, the backdrop of a vastly changed role of police officers in Scotland today, tackling a mental health crisis, picking up the pieces when every other broken public services has closed the doors and gone home. And that's against the backdrop of crumbling police buildings and cars, a lack of kit, IT and software systems which leave much to be desired. And in my view, clear clashes in direction between those at the top of policing and those on the ground doing the work itself. Now, I personally have witnessed and heard anecdotally a very glacial them and us environment which exists between the leadership and the rank and file. And that also exists equally between civilian and commissioned roles in Police Scotland as well. Now, this bill will not fix any of that. This bill conveniently ignores those long-standing organisational failures in Police Scotland. The current Secretary of the SPF, David Kennedy, wrote to every MSP yesterday, raising more worrying points about this legislation. His concerns have been well debated today, that vetting could be used as a very poor substitute for misconduct practices, a very blunt tool to dismiss officers via the back door. Now, I won't dance on the procedural head of the pin, but this sort of substantive amendment without proper consultation at stage one should never have occurred. It itself is unsatisfactory. But we are now faced, unfortunately, with the conundrum, Presiding Officer, of being asked to support a bill which victims' organisations, for whom I have the greatest of respect, broadly welcome the aims and ambitions of it. The public, of course, deserve due and robust complaints procedures. But the detail of the bill has been described as problematic and concerning by the very body which represents frontline officers. That is far from ideal. I have no doubt that there are bad eggs in policing, as there is in any large public body, so beefing up the misconduct rules is broadly welcome. I also believe that too many people have been let down in the face of very complex complaints procedures, and that too, of course, must be fixed. And for some people, that trust has been lost forever in Police Scotland, in what they deem to be institutional cover-ups, fuelled by colleague camaraderie or even misplaced loyalty. So in that sense, I will support the bill today, but in doing so, let us never forget it is always the tiniest minority of police officers who fall short of our high expectations. Because I want victims and the public to know that, yes, we take misconduct seriously, but I also want every serving police officer and civilian staff in Police Scotland to know that this Parliament has their backs too. Because striking that balance has never been easy and will never be easy, but it must be done for all our sakes. Presiding Officer.
Thank you. We move to winding up speeches, and I call on Maggie Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In my opening speech, I spoke about some of the worst that bad policing can lead to, about people lost to violent and early deaths, about families who hold, with their loving memories, clear visions for transformational change. For these are not random tragedies, but deadly intersections of harm by individual officers with institutional, cultural and systemic patterns of prejudice, misogyny and intimidation. That is why, to make effective change, our response, I believe, must be threefold. Firstly, it must address the individual, making sure that serious inquiry is made of all police officers and anyone who applies to join. That means scrupulous, robust and repeated vetting. And I am very grateful that this issue has been well discussed this afternoon, and I have no doubt that there will be ongoing scrutiny of this and related issues in the coming months and years. Because nothing that the police do is more important than ensuring that they themselves are not the cause of serious harm. Second, it must address police culture, dismantling the wall of silence described by Stephanie Bonner, and the toxic assumptions that enabled Wayne Couzens and others to abuse their power so horrifically. That means a code of ethics that is not only disseminated, but adhered to and internalised, with robust duties of candour and cooperation that are universally understood and enacted. And I'm sure Sharon Dowie's amendment will go some way to ensure those. Thirdly, it must ensure that complaints are taken seriously, investigated properly, independently, swiftly and comprehensively, with respect and humanity. That means having systems that are accessible, fair, trauma-informed and appropriately transparent. Policing by consent, discussed already by the Cabinet Secretary, Liam MacArthur and Jamie Green, cannot mean mere public toleration, but active relationships of trust, communication and responsibility. That responsibility must include acknowledgement when mistakes are made and apologies to those who are harmed. Stephanie Bonner, in her evidence, said, "The system is absolutely designed to break you." So, Presiding Officer, it is now time for healing. So this evening I reiterate the support of the Scottish Greens for this bill. It is an important step in making Scotland's policing more sensitive, more just and more accountable. But this bill alone, as many witnesses have testified, will not be enough. We need to change cultures, change attitudes, both within Police Scotland and within our wider society. It will not be easy. Can police officers maintain camaraderie and concern for one another's safety and welfare without the secrecy, impunity, prejudice and misogyny which too often accompany them? Can our media, our educators and we ourselves dare to shine a critical light on police institutions and activities while still recognising the good to which the vast majority of officers aspire? Can individual police officers speak out when their consciences require, without being intimidated or ostracised? As I suggested back in this bill's Stage 1 debate, if we were starting from scratch, we might create something very different from today's police forces. But this is where we are, what we have now, and it is the system with which we must engage. Reform will be an ongoing and iterative process, sometimes painful, sometimes faltering. But our vision is clear, of a future where policing is truly for the benefit of all, not only those of privilege, where wrong can be redressed and justice for all in Scotland is an active reality. Thank you.
Thank you. Members will wish to know that we do have a little time in hand, and I call on Katie Clark.
I'm pleased to close this debate on behalf of Scottish Labour. We will support this bill today, although we have had significant concerns about the bill during the scrutiny process. We recognise, however, that this bill comes to us as a result of the Angelini review, and we accept that some of the changes should be made. We, however, believe there still needs to be significant cultural change in our police service, and that this bill in itself isn't going to deliver that. The police itself accept they are institutionally sexist and racist, and cases such as Sheikh O'Bayo and Ian Packer highlight some of the concern. This bill is technical and far from transformational, and we believe it fails to address some of the legitimate concerns that are being raised by the public about policing and the handling of complaints. And in response to Maggie Chapman, I would say we also think it's unlikely to address some of the very significant issues that are being raised in high-profile cases. There was significant concern about the adequacy of the financial memorandum at Stage 1, and we are pleased that these have been addressed. As Pauline McNeill said, we were also specifically concerned that the amendments relating to vetting procedures were made late and therefore were not scrutinised by the committee. The Scottish Police Federation and Unison have raised concerns about some of the potential implications for police officers and police staff. Scottish Labour ourselves have been concerned both about the level of engagement with the unions and some of the concerns they are raising. As I've said before, I warmly welcome the additional resources which have been put into vetting by the Scottish Government as a result of high-profile cases such as Wayne's cousins. And we recognise that there is a need for vetting to be strengthened. But given the lack of scrutiny during this bill process and what the Cabinet Secretary has said today, I very much hope that it will be possible to have a cross-party consensus as we move forward with the changes as we proceed. There is real concern about how this legislation will be perceived in the employment space, and that it will be used as a disciplinary procedure. I understand that the Scottish Government's position is that the duty of candour relates to institutions and does not impact on the employment rights of individuals. And it would be helpful if the Cabinet Secretary could put that on the record today, given the concerns specifically being raised by Unison and the Scottish Police Federation. The Criminal Justice Committee heard evidence from a number of witnesses who complained about their treatment by the police and about the police complaints process. It's fair to say that some of the evidence the committee heard was shocking and harrowing. And indeed today, both Fergus Ewan and Maggie Chapman have spoken about specific cases. However, it's far from clear that the bill we are discussing today will make any difference to the experience of those witnesses. We recognise the very difficult job our police service perform and the significant risks they take on a daily basis. However, public institutions must behave with candour, and we pay tribute to all the campaigners who have led to this type of legislation being brought forward across the UK. However, we recognise that this bill itself falls short of what is required to address some of those injustices and breaches of trust. And we look forward to continuing to work across this Parliament on these issues, recognising that this bill passed today is unlikely to make the significant differences that we believe are required if we are to meet the challenges that have been put to us.
Thank you, and I call on Liam Kerr.
Presiding Officer, I've listened very carefully to the Stage 3 debate this afternoon, having not been directly involved in this bill until shortly before the Stage 3 consideration commenced. Now, since entering Parliament, I've heard a number of MSPs plead that we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. What I fear is that this bill represents a case that, by failing to seek perfection, that I actually think we need to strive for when we are legislating, this Parliament risks settling for just about good enough. Because on one hand, this bill is important and will achieve very important changes, as my colleague Sharon Dowie set out in her submission. That's a point that was reinforced by the persuasive submissions that we got from Victim Support Scotland just last night, where they actively urged us to support this legislation. Changes such as the new Code of Ethics, which has been welcomed as a step in the right direction, the duty of candour, which, whilst being welcomed, has had some asking whether it will have a meaningful impact. And perhaps the Cabinet Secretary can allay those fears in closing when she answers Unison and the SPF's challenges that Katie Clark just raised. There are changes to the disciplinary processes, which allow them to continue even after the cessation of engagement, or the independent adjudication of senior officers, and the significantly expanded powers for the PARC. I will.
Douglas Ross.
I'm grateful to Liam Kerr giving way. Does he agree with the point I made during the consideration of amendments? I cited a constituency case where someone complained against the police 16 months ago and was told yesterday that it had still not been allocated to someone to investigate. If we have confidence in this system, Police Scotland need to get an awful lot better at dealing with these complaints and resolving them, because complainants need answers.
Liam Kerr.
Yes, I think that's a very important point, and it actually goes towards not only that, but also what will be achieved by this bill, because as I set out at the start, there are areas where I think this bill is far from ideal. So at committee just this morning, the PARC candidly admitted that they are unclear at this stage what the extent of the extra workload on them will be. They acknowledged that they're running at full capacity already, and whilst they will, of course, do their best to meet all objectives put on them, that requires adequate resource. But they're not in a position at this stage to say what the additional costs are that are being imposed by this bill. And that, in a situation where their annual report has said, the PARC has already said, they are having to request additional funding for staff costs and temporary funding for legal fees. And their uncertainty is understandable, given that, as Katie Clark brought up, the financial memorandum's projections from last summer were at least £4 million lower than necessary to meet the obligations, as they existed at the time. Now, the government admitted at Finance Committee that the government had failed to take account of inflation and pay rises whilst using scenarios and figures relating to September 2022. This is a bill in 2024. Now, of course, we've got a new financial memorandum in November last year, which the government will say is authoritative. But this bill has also got a whole raft of new features and requirements added to it, such as vetting and items which will be developed as a result of this bill. So my general position of having little, if indeed any, confidence in the government's financial projections has not changed. And finally, on that vetting that I mentioned, like Pauline McNeill, I am deeply uncomfortable that something as important as this has been introduced at stage 2, and thus not subject to the usual call for views or consultation. Now, I think there's a wider point here about how we legislate in this place, but that is for another day. The fact is that we have received some significant concerns in the last couple of days from the SPF around those vetting process changes, as Jamie Green flagged in his remarks earlier. And these worry me, because I'm listening to the amendment debates earlier and reading the SPF's concerns, and it seems to me more than possible that there is something there. Now, as MSPs, we've done our best to amend the provisions, but will those amendments address the concerns? Will they head off the unintended consequences? I think it's difficult to say, because these provisions were only brought in at stage 2 and lack detail. So perhaps again, in closing, the Cabinet Secretary can set out her response to the Federation's concerns and hopefully allay them. And that's the issue, Presiding Officer, because given all the good things that are brought in by this bill, I will vote for it at decision time tonight. But as with so many bills emanating from this government, it is far from perfect. And I hope the Cabinet Secretary will now make the case that it will be good enough for now. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary to wind up.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I do very much want to thank all members for their contributions during today's debate and for the, by and large, spirit of constructive cooperation that has been evident throughout the journey of the bill, despite one or two feisty moments. It is very clear to me, when I have listened to the contribution of Maggie Chapman today, Douglas Ross, Fergus Ewan and many others throughout the committee process, that they have been deeply affected and deeply touched by the personal testimony of individuals and their families when matters have not been dealt with as they should. And the value of those with lived experience of the complaints and misconduct system has been deeply informative, I think, to all of our collective deliberations, not least the journey of this bill. But in equal measure, what was also apparent to me throughout the scrutiny of this bill is that there was also a very deep desire to ensure fairness to our police officers. And I think I should also pay tribute to Audrey Nicholl, the chair of the Criminal Justice Committee, because as a former police officer, I think she embodies both that determination to have exemplar public services, particularly in policing, where we always have to strive for greater and better, but also we need to ensure fairness to frontline staff as well. And I would want to pay tribute to Audrey's scrupulous and her fairness, but also her determination on behalf of all members of the committee, not just to raise issues, but Ms Nicholl and the committee as a whole are always determined to follow matters up, and they never just raise a concern as a one-off. They will always see issues through, and I see that with this bill, but also with other work that the committee has pursued, particularly in relation to policing and mental health. And therefore, I echo the comments made by members, including Ms Dowie, that we will all have to continue to work together, not least because there will be a massive amount of regulations to bring forward to committee. And let me reiterate that whether it's in relation to issues raised by PERC and their new responsibilities should this bill pass, or the debate that we've all had in and around vetting, that there will indeed be further consultation, whether that is at the Scottish Police Consultative Forum, before regulations are brought forward to Parliament, or indeed in the engagement that I have with individual organisations as well. And our approach to improvement has been, first and foremost, to concentrate on the non-legislative recommendations as recommended by Lady Angelini, to now focus on the bill, to take forward the legislative requirements, and we now have to get into the business of regulations. And so I do, with all of that in mind, want to reiterate my thanks to my Scottish Government officials. I know at
Cabinet
times...
Secretary, if I might just ask you to pause for a second. I am aware of several conversations taking place across the Chamber. I'd be grateful if we could focus on the Cabinet Secretary's remarks. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I want to reiterate my thanks to the Bill team, but also to thank officials from government departments and policing bodies right across the four home nations who have engaged with my officials to help form cross-border provisions which the Bill provides powers to enact, and that includes the Home Office, the Northern Ireland Executive, the Scottish Office and the College of Policing. And it is also important to acknowledge the wealth of evidence submitted to the Criminal Justice Committee to help shape the bill, whether that came from Amnesty International UK, Victim Support Scotland, the Equality and Human Rights Commission and the Scottish Human Rights Commission and the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner, and of course once again to thank all of those individuals with lived experience, organisation and policing stakeholders that have supported and informed the development of the bill. Presiding Officer, I won't reiterate either the Stage 1 or the Stage 2 debate, but if I can just say two things briefly. In terms of vetting, if I had ignored the HMICS recommendation or indeed the Criminal Justice Committee to bring forward an amendment around vetting, I think I would have been criticised in equal measure. Nonetheless, I think the debate in and around the detail of the vetting provisions have been well motivated and will, of course, strengthen our engagement as we go forward. In terms of Katie Clark's question around the organisational duty of candour, the individual duty of candour will only apply to those who hold the office of constable. The organisational duty of candour will apply to those in an indirect manner under the control of the Chief Constable, and that is constables and police staff. Presiding Officer, I'm just going to end with two quotes because I think it captures what we are all endeavouring to achieve, and that is firstly a quote from Lady Angelini when she gave evidence to the Criminal Justice Committee last year. And she says, the system in Scotland is possibly nearly as good as you can get it. It's always possible to improve the system and to incorporate good ideas that could enhance it, but generally it is significantly better than it was when I started as a young fiscal deputy. And of course, Presiding Officer, our journey must continue, because again, if I can quote Lady Elish, when she said instant results are seldom possible and seldom sustained. Changing the culture is a long-term game, but it is worth investing time, effort and resource now to lay solid foundations for that process of change that is absolutely essential. And I commend this bill to Parliament because it is another vital step forward.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on Police, Ethics, Conduct and Scrutiny Scotland Bill. It's now time to move on to the next item of business. And that is consideration of Business Motion 16113 in the name of Jamie Hepburn on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme. And I call on Jamie Hepburn to move the motion.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. No member has asked to speak to the motion. Therefore, the question is that motion 16113 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed. The next item of business is consideration of Parliamentary Bureau Motion 16114 on approval of an SSI, and I ask Jamie Hepburn on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau to move the motion.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. And I now call on Craig Hoy. Up to 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I rise to speak against this increase in the additional dwelling supplement contained within the SSI. In the Finance Committee, Liz Smith and myself voted against this change because of the likely effect on the housing market and also because it amounts to another SNP stealth tax. While the Government says that its recent policy changes are not negatively impacting the buy-to-let market, that is not the evidence that we are receiving anecdotally, both from landlords who are leaving the market and also those who are not adding to their portfolios. And it is not what the sector says either. Timothy Douglas, Head of Policy and Campaigns at Property Mark, makes clear when he says, with huge demand for private rented property and long-term rent control measures contained in the Housing Bill, the Scottish Government's decision to raise EDS from 6% to 8% is out of touch with the housing needs of Scotland. Now, I concede that it may have less of an impact on the build-to-rent market because transactions that involve more than 6 properties are excluded from ADS. But surely that the Government must concede that many buy-to-let investors have only a couple of properties. And now to a point that the Public Finance Minister somewhat casually dealt with when he gave evidence to the Finance Committee, and this cannot be easily disregarded. If somebody buys a buy-to-let property for £200,000, they will have to pay £16,000 in ADS, and this will undoubtedly be passed on to the tenant through a higher rent. So, as I point, I will give way on that point.
John Mason.
I thank the member very much for giving way. Would you also accept, though, that that will advantage first-time buyers and it will make it easier for a first-time buyer to compete with somebody who's buying to let?
Craig Hoy.
I will address that point in a second because, as I pointed out to the Minister, this tax is and will much more so be a contributing factor to the significant rent increases seen in Scotland because it will constrain supply. We know that at 12%, Edinburgh is the highest rent rises in the UK, and nationwide suggests that higher rents are now preventing some tenants who would become first-time buyers from saving the deposits in order to be able to buy their first home, which is actually the stated policy and objective of the ADS. The Nationwide said house prices remain high relative to average earnings, which meant that the deposit hurdle remained high for prospective first-time buyers. This is, they said, a challenge that has been made worse by record rates of rental growth in recent years, which has hampered the ability of many in the private rented sector to save their deposits. In evidence to the committee, the Minister gave us little confidence that the policy intent of this tax rise was being met, describing the picture as, quotes, subject to all kinds of factors. The Government, however, has announced that a review will be conducted to explore various aspects and elements of LBTT, and this could potentially include the additional dwelling supplement. And I hope that even if this tax rise passes tonight, that the Government will still commit to a review of ADS. Now, the sad fact is that in the Finance Committee, Scottish Labour voted for this tax rise. Anna Sarwar appears spineless when it comes to standing up to the Scottish Government on the Scottish budget. The increase in the additional dwelling supplement is just one bad element of a bad budget that will pass next month because Scottish Labour have caved in without concessions to the SNP. The Scottish Conservatives will, however, side with common sense and oppose this latest SNP tax rise.
Thank you. I call on Ivan McKee to respond. Up to 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax, additional amount transactions relating to second homes, etc. Amendment Order 2024 increases the rate of the additional dwelling supplement from 6% to 8% with effect from 5 December 2024. This increase is intended to further protect opportunities for first-time buyers and home movers by helping them to compete with buy-to-let investors and second homeowners. It means, for example, that someone purchasing a £200,000 property as an additional home will have to pay £16,600 more in tax than a first-time buyer would. The increase is also forecast to raise much-needed revenue at a time when public finances are under significant pressure. The SFC estimate that it will generate an additional £32 million from the ADS in the next financial year, contributing to a forecast total for net ADS of £258 million. This forecast incorporates the SFC's assumptions about the behavioural effects of the change, including the extent to which it will result in more main market purchases by first-time buyers and home movers than would otherwise have been the case. Some members have raised concerns about the potential impact of this measure on the provision of housing for private rent. Although the stated policy intent of the increase is to support further opportunities in the main market, particularly for first-time buyers, I recognise the private rented sector's importance in Scotland's housing system. I know that not everyone can or wishes to buy their own home or easily access affordable housing. We are committed to ensuring that the private rented sector in Scotland is an attractive and affordable option for those who make use of it. We are working to achieve this by ensuring the sector provides good quality homes through improved standards and effective regulatory systems. We also want to encourage investment in the sector, so I of course take these concerns seriously. Although I appreciate that the circumstances may be different, similar concerns were raised when the ADS was first introduced and again when the rate was increased to 6% in 2022. Although a range of factors such as interest rates and general housing market performance must be considered, I note that ADS transactions and revenue in 2023-24 were higher than initially forecast. I recognise the tax is, of course, just one factor that will be considered. However, I am not aware of any systemic evidence that the ADS has had a significant detrimental impact on the availability of homes for rent in Scotland. The latest available data, in fact, from the Scottish Landlord Register, for example, indicates that landlord numbers have remained relatively stable since the beginning of 2022, with a number of properties that are available for rent increasing over that period. However, we will continue to monitor this and consider all available data concerning the private rented sector. We are supporting the emergence of a larger scale PRS by maintaining the relief from ADS where 6 properties or more are acquired in a single transaction. And this has repeatedly been highlighted as a positive differentiator for Scotland in our effort to support the emergence of a larger scale build-to-rent sector. We recognise build-to-rent's role as a mainstream housing delivery model that makes an important contribution to the broader housing market. I look forward to continuing our engagement with the sector on this matter. Members have also raised concerns about the potential impact of the tax where difficult or exceptional circumstances may apply, and we are taking forward an ADS review which will conclude in April 2024 to address many of these matters.
Minister, I must ask you to conclude at this point. No, finally, Minister, I need to ask you to conclude in order to comply with our standing orders. Thank you. Point of order.
I need to make a declaration of interest to members with regard to my register of interest with regard to private rented property.
Thank you. That may not be a point of order, Minister, but it is now on the record. And the question on the motion that has just been debated will be put at decision time. The next item of business is consideration of 4 Parliamentary Bureau motions, and I ask Jamie Hepburn, on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, to move motions 16115 and 16116 on approval of SSIs, 16117 on committee membership and 16118 on committee substitute.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. And the question on these motions will be put at decision time, and there are 3 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is that motion 16093, in the name of Angela Constance, on Police, Ethics, Conduct and Scrutiny Scotland Bill at stage 3 be agreed. And as this is a motion to pass the bill, the question must be decided by division. So there will be a very short suspension at this moment to allow members to access the digital voting system.